LLC, Pestgeek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen Van Tassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pestgeek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope your week is going well. I've certainly been pretty busy. Had a chance to canoe part of the Missouri River, about 20 miles of it the other day. So that was something, and then got to look at something called Decision Point, which is where Lewis and Clark were deciding which river to pick, whether it was the Marias, which they didn't know was the Marias, or the Missouri, to find Great Falls. And so ultimately they chose correctly, thank goodness, because it would have been they really would have extended their trip even more and put them in jeopardy, of course. So but in any event, I hope you have a chance to get some relaxation during the summer. But things still keep pressing on ahead. So as do I. So here we are with another episode. So do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the podcast, ring the bell. If you could give us a 5-star review, we would be most appreciative. Those of you that don't want to use YouTube can certainly find me on Rumble, and you can just go to Wildlife Control Consultant on the Rumble site, and the podcast is posted there as well. Definitely reach out to me if you have questions, concerns, comments, criticisms. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you if you want to be on the show. Perhaps you have a new technique or talk about something in the industry that's bothering you. Definitely reach out. Would love to have you on the show to talk about various things. I think it's disappointing that we don't have more wildlife control operators who are interested in being on the show. But in any event, people are shy for whatever reason, and so but it's certainly available for those that are certainly interested. This week, I wanted to talk a little bit about structured decision making. So yeah, it's not necessarily a vertebrate pest topic per se, but it's still an important one. And so let me kind of pull up my slideshow here. So it's called structured decision making. And because the challenge is, how do we make decisions properly? I mean, have you ever regretted? I mean, I'm always fascinated. You'll see the interviews of various Hollywood people, and they said, as you look back over your life, would you have changed anything? And they're like, oh, no, I wouldn't change a thing. I think that person's either a moron or a liar. So if you've looked over your life and have never wanted to change something, or you thought that you made a poor decision and every decision you made was perfect, I just find that just really hard to believe, or you've had an incredibly blessed life. Nevertheless, we need to have a system or a plan on how we're making decisions, because too often we're flying by the seat of our pants and we're making poor ones. We may be making things too emotionally. Perhaps we haven't had a sufficient amount of data to make a decision. But some people go the opposite direction. They have analysis paralysis. In other words, they're so afraid of making a wrong decision that they fail to make any decision, which, as you all know, is a decision even on its own. Well, I've got someone that I've been kind of admire here. Her name is Annie Duke. It's now Dr. Annie Duke. She's finally finished her PhD. She actually had to she dropped out of her PhD work because of some health issues. And now, something like 20 years later, she has finally finished it. It's something in the area of psychology and thinking. But during the time when she was ill and recovering, and so her dissertation she was all but dissertation, so she hadn't been working on her dissertation because of this illness that came on to her. And then, of course, other things in her life. She got into a career of being a world champion poker player. Now, one of the interesting things about being a poker player is that you have to make a lot of decisions in a short amount of time with limited information. and that's what makes it poker, right? Well, she argues that learning about the process of being a poker player and making decisions helped her understand the decision-making process, because you were able to fine-tune your decision, because you know that obviously you're having to deal with things like probability, what's the likelihood of a certain card coming up, how strong is your hand, and you've got to make bets based on your understanding of probability. And then of course there's a psycho-emotional side of things. And so she was clearly gifted in this particular area, but she's also a student of it, because she had to learn and memorize all these things, because you have to make decisions relatively quickly in these poker games. And so she became a world champion and had a prize purse into the millions of dollars. And so absolutely amazing. And she actually lived in Montana for a while. So she actually did some poker playing down in a city called Billings, which is just several hours from me. So her point is something that we have a challenge with here, even in our own business. How do we make decisions knowing we don't have all the information? And let me make this more personal to you in the wildlife control field. How do you decide whether to add a different service line, to move into a different species, add another species that you control, perhaps adding an employee? How do you make these decisions knowing that you don't have all the facts? And how do you make them wisely so that you minimize the risk, but yet you're also not paralyzed by thinking that somehow you can have godlike knowledge over the decision you're about ready to make? And so she believes in training people in doing this, and so she's created this sort of nonprofit website called alliancefordecisioneducation.org. Check it out. I'm not making any money doing this. I bought some of her books, and we'll talk about that here. But I thought some of you might be interested in some of her thoughts here, to think about. We're going to do something called, meta thinking, in a sense. We're going to be thinking about thinking. We're going to be thinking about the decision process so that we can learn to make better decisions that are more structured. That's where structured decision making comes about. Well, she's written a few books, as I've already mentioned. Here they are in chronological order. For those of you that are listening to the podcast and not seeing the video, I'll read them out for you. So her first one was published in 2018, and it was entitled Thinking in Bets: Making Smarter Decisions When You Don't Have All the Facts. And again, the author is, of course, Annie Duke, D-U-K-E, Annie Duke. Her second book was published in 2020, and it was How to Decide: Simple Tools for Making Better Choices. And then her most recent book, at least the ones that I'm aware of, is Quit: The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away by Annie Duke. And that was published in 2022. So Thinking in Bets, How to Decide, Quit are the three books that she's written on this particular subject. It turns out, when I did a little bit of reading, looking into this on the net, found that she also wrote some books about being a better gambler. For those of you that are interested in being a gambler, she's a pretty good writer, and I'm sure that she's as good in talking about gambling as she is on this particular issue. So I'll leave that to you. So the way she begins to talk about this is that she says that our decisions basically fall into two main categories. So the first thing we need to do when we have to make a decision is we need to decide, is this an important decision, or is this a not important decision? For example, how much time do you spend worrying about your socks, for instance? Are you going to wear them? What color are you going to have? What style are you going to have? Do you really agonize over this? Chances are most of you in the audience don't even think about it. President Obama said that one of the things that he did is he basically had suits that were like all the same color, so he didn't have to make didn't have to think about it because he had so many other decisions he had to make in his office. This was just one thing he could eliminate that he had to worry about. He just picked a color suit and got a bunch of them, and he didn't have to worry about what he had to wear every day. And so those were ways that he basically tried to figure out how to eliminate various types of decisions so that he could save time and mental energy. Because when you're getting into complex and serious questions, it takes time and energy. This is why sometimes people work off the seat of their pants, is they just don't want to think about it anymore, and they just want to make a decision. And you as business owners have to be thinking seriously about how you're making these decisions, because some of them could have serious consequences. Of course, many of you already know that the average business in America doesn't last 5 years. So clearly, decisions were made that probably weren't wise, and that cost the company, whatever the case may be. And we want to try to minimize that. There's always going to be risk and the uncertainty in business, but we want to try to put the odds in our favor, knowing that there are obviously things outside of our control, but we want to try to make sure we're managing our decisions based on what we can control and making good choices so that we look back and we say, it just didn't work out. So let's talk about what she said. So we're going to be focusing here on complex or serious issues, not, are you going to have a sandwich for lunch or steak? Hopefully that's a low significance question for you, as opposed to, should I hire a new employee or should I not hire a new employee? So we're going to be focusing on those complex or serious decisions. So this is what she describes as the decision process. And if you think about it, we do some of these elements all the time, but there's probably several items here that would help us make better decisions in the future if we broke it down into its various elements. So the first element is framing. And what she means by framing is, she says, what are the parameters of the decision that you need to make? Are there deadlines for it? Is how much money are we talking about? How much time do you have? How significant of an issue? How many things does this decision impact? Does it impact your family and children and spouse, business partners perhaps? How will it affect the quality of your life? And so you need to figure out, what are the parameters, what are the ins and outs of this particular decision that you're going to make? And so you want to make sure that you figure out what are the limits of it. And so, because that will help you evaluate how serious of a decision this has to be. The second element is how you clarify your values. And so this is going to be important, because a lot of people will say, oh, my family is number one, and then they'll make sure they're working 80 hours a week. Well, does that really sound like family is number one with you if you're working 80 hours a week? Probably not, right? So what she's telling you to do is that you have to decide what is important to you. For example, if you have a question of, should I take a job? Should I take a promotion? Or should I hire on this new worker? Or should I enter this particular contract? Should I buy this new $10,000 piece of equipment? What are the values? How do those decisions match your particular values? Are you buying something because you think you're going to argue that it's going to help your business, or are you buying it because it's really a toy and you want to play with it, and under the guise of being business? So you need to be sure that you're doing something that is accords with whatever morals and values that you live by. Because actually, then how do you decide that? What you do is what you believe. We all do what we believe. So that's the way you find out what you truly believe. If you truly believe in something, you do that. If you don't believe it, you don't do it. And so this is, sometimes people have this sort of disconnect. So you need to be sure you evaluate, how are you when you're making this decision. Like, for example, if you had to fire someone, that would be another decision. That's a serious decision. How would you go about firing it? And so if you have values about I want to be respectful of people, well, then that's going to govern how you talk to this individual. Did you give this person enough mentoring time? So that's where you're clarifying your values. The third element of a decision is you're handling trade-offs. And that is, if you have to make a decision like which truck you're going to buy, are you going to buy truck A or buy truck B? So you're looking at, well, maybe one costs $5,000 less than the other one, but the one that costs $5,000 more may have a warranty that's double what the $5,000 one costs less. Now, those are trade-offs that you have to figure out. What are the elements of this decision, and how do they compare? So you've seen people do the decision making. They'll make two columns, and they'll do pros and cons, right? Well, those are where you're evaluating trade-offs, and so that is something that you have to do. And it's very helpful to be sure that you're clear about what you're giving up and what you're taking, because that will also help you clarify what is actually important to you in this particular instance. Fourth, you need to gather information. And so this is a linear description of the decision-making process, but understand that it's iterative in the sense you're going back and forth across different elements of this decision process as you work your way through it. So as you gather information, you may be going back to the handling of trade-offs, you may be clarifying your values. So don't think of it as, well, I finished step 1, I never go back to step 1. No, you may find something in number 4 that helps you understand the frame of the decision making that you didn't know before, and now you're needing to adjust. Maybe there's a deadline that's been changed. Maybe you're discovering that you didn't have a clear enough understanding about your values. Maybe money is a lot more important to you than you think it was, right? Maybe your family life was more important to you than you thought it was. And so these are things that you're going to be clarifying as you're working through it. And so the point is, it's not about necessarily a right or wrong per se. It's making sure that you are thinking about your process of making this decision and not just simply relying on a gut reaction or what you think someone else wants. Number 5 is you need to predict possible outcomes. And that is, here you're trying to think about, if I make decision A, what could happen that could be good? What could happen that could be bad? For example, you hire an employee. What could be possible is if you hire a good one, you might make more money. If you hire a bad one, it's going to cost you money. But also, even with a good worker, you're going to have to spend some time training and managing this person. So you may think, if you're hiring someone, you may think you're doubling yourself, but the reality is you're not. You're only going to get probably 90% of your time, because 10% of that person's time is going to be managing, because you're going to have to take some time of yourself and manage this person. So it's not going to be 100% growth in your income, okay? So those are thinking about the consequences of a particular decision so that you don't get surprised by something. Now, obviously, you can't predict every possible scenario. You just can't. However, you're trying to think about what is the likelihood of various consequences. It's the same thing when you decide to put a conibear over a squirrel hole. You may think you're going to catch a squirrel out of that, but the reality is you don't have certainty that a squirrel is the one that's going to come out through that. You may find another animal go into it, right? So, however, but you still make the decision to do it, providing it's legal in your state, because you know the odds are overwhelming. You're like, well, I saw a squirrel run into the hole. I'm going to put a conibear over that particular hole. Well, you know, there's no guarantee that the squirrel's going to come out through that hole. You just have a very strong opinion and likelihood that that's going to happen. So this is where you're trying to predict those possible outcomes. Number 6 is a very important step, and that is, whatever decision you're going to make, will you be able to explain it? Will you be able to give a rational reason for why you made the decision. Here's the dirty little secret that a lot of people don't think about, and that is most of the decisions we make on the basis of emotion, and then we use reason to justify the decision that we emotionally made. That's just kind of the facts of it all. A lot of us, we may think we're more rational or Spock-like, for those of you who watch Star Trek, but the reality is we're not. We're far more emotional in our decision-making process than others. This is why you see people who make decisions based on emotion, even to the detriment of themselves, because they allow their emotions and their ego and their anger to dominate their decision process, even though they do something that's counter to what is actually beneficial to them. Number 7, of course, is you ultimately have to make a decision. And by the way, not making a decision is making a decision. So there's no way to get out of the decision process. So you're ultimately going to have to make a decision, whether it's by not making a decision, which is a decision, or by making a determination of how you're going to move forward. Because it is possible to just simply say, you know what, I don't have enough information here. I'm not comfortable with going forward. My decision is to table this decision. That is a decision that's perfectly legitimate depending on your situation. And then, of course, lastly, you want to reflect on your decision and the process that you use. Did you miss something? Did you fail to get enough information? Did you think deeply enough about your goals and values and what you want out of life? And so again, this process is just one big circle. You're going to be going over these items over and over and over again as you're in this decision-making process. So I hope this kind of helps you reflect on your decision process and have something where you can structure it and say, okay, I want to go through these particular eight steps. You say, Stephen, I don't have the time for that. I'm telling you, you don't have to do this for every decision. We're doing this for the big decisions that are going to have major impact on your life. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about how we make some decisions, and so some ideas to help you move things along. There's a concept called a free roll, and that is when a decision has minimal or zero consequences. If I told you that if you emailed XYZ company, they would send you a free trap, shipping everything. You wouldn't even have to give them a credit card number. Just give them your address and your name, fill it out. They will ship you a trap. That would be called a free roll decision. That is, there's no negative downside to this particular decision. Why do you think so many businesses sell a product saying 30-day money-back guarantee? They're trying to make this a risk-free decision so that you can get over buyer's remorse. That's called a free roll. So the point is when you encounter decisions that are basically of no consequence, in other words, there's no negative, there's no downside, then go ahead and do it, because what are you going to lose? Another principle in decision making is knowing when to quit. For example, let's say you hire an employee. What will it take for you to ultimately fire? Now, the rule of thumb is, of course, hire slow, fire fast. But we know that's often easier said than done, because when we fire someone, we have to acknowledge that we made a mistake. And that's very difficult for people to realize. So sometimes we'll hold on to an employee longer than we should, because when we fire them, we have to admit we made a mistake. Now, obviously, if there's a financial situation, that's a different story, right? But generally speaking, we're firing people because they screwed up or they just don't have what it takes to do the job. That's a mistake. I mean, something in your hiring process missed something. So she recommends that when you're making some of these big decisions, what is the quitting threshold? Because quitting is an important part of the decision process, because you don't want to throw good money after bad. By the same token, you don't want to quit too soon. But you need to be able to say to yourself, I'm going to try something here, and if I get these types of results, I'm going to keep going. And if I'm not getting the kinds of results, Sometimes our timing is bad. Sometimes we're making a great decision, but the timing is wrong, right? So this is where you want to be able to stop yourself so that you're not throwing good money after bad. Okay? That's where you want to set that threshold. Sometimes when we make decisions, we have to protect ourselves. And this is called the Ulysses contract. Those of you that ever read the Odyssey know that Ulysses is the Latin version of Odysseus. Odysseus is the Greek name. Ulysses is the Latin name. And so you remember that he was on a ship and he wanted to hear the sirens. The problem was the sirens, when you listened to their beautiful singing, made people go mad, and they would jump off the ship and then they would drown in the ocean. So what he did was he had his men tie him to the masthead of the ship so that he could then listen to the music but couldn't do anything rash. That's called the Ulysses contract. So there are times when we need to have people holding us accountable on a decision. Sometimes people do this with alcohol. They'll say, I'm only going to have 3 beers tonight, and I'm asking you to make sure that I won't have 3 beers. Other people do that like with gambling. They'll they'll only carry cash. They'll leave all their credit cards back in their hotel room or give it to their spouse, and they will walk into the casino with a set amount of cash so that when they run out, they run out. That's a Ulysses contract. That's something you can do to help reduce the negative side effects of a decision when you think you can't stop yourself. It's called Ulysses contract. Another important concept in making a decision that she talks about is called when you do a post-mortem. That is, you evaluate your decision. And so something that she's talked about a great deal was something called resulting. Now, resulting is when people evaluate a decision based on the outcome. Now, that may seem a little counterintuitive to you, but her point is that there were plenty of times with her as being a gambler where she made the right bet based on the probabilities and the numbers, but she still lost. And what happens is if you think that the decision she made was wrong, then you're doing what's called resulting. And that is, sometimes we make the right decision, but we just get unlucky, or things didn't roll our way. And what she wants us to do is to think about making wise decisions and not always look at the resulting. It's where people make a decision and they do their research and they buy a truck and the truck breaks down in the first week and they're like, I should have bought the other vehicle. That's called resulting, even though that company may have had a better track record than the other company. You just happened to get unlucky. You didn't make a bad decision. You just got a little unlucky. And so it's very important for us to do this in our business. And this is why the fact is, sometimes people are successful at business because they were in the right place at the right time. And they just got lucky. And so sometimes we made all the right decisions about a business and it didn't work out. So we have to be careful about how we judge people. But this is something we need to do in terms of judging ourselves. And that is, avoid the problem of resulting. And ask yourself, did you follow a structured decision process? And if you did, and the decision went and the outcome went bad, then it's just sometimes just bad luck that you didn't do the wrong thing. Or you may have found that you missed something, right? Another thing to evaluate when you're making a decision, this is often something you can do to help the predictive power, and that is, would this decision make you happy? And this is what you'd see when sometimes people will say, imagine if you flip a coin and you get the answer, like you're having 2 choices and you're not sure which choice to make, and you flip the coin to make a decision, and the answer is something, are you happy with what the coin said, or are you sad with what the coin said? That is how we're able to predict the future. It helps us make decisions when the pros and cons of 2 different decisions are very close together. Predict what that decision would feel like for you. Something that in terms of that can help you move in the right direction. And then she also points out that it's important for us not to panic. And what she means by this is most decisions we make in life are not eternal. We have the opportunity to undo them or adjust the decision that we made. And we need to make sure that we are aware of that. So sometimes we tend to overstate what a decision be. Oh, this is going to be the most important decision of our life. It's more complicated than that. And in some cases, we can often adjust our decision after we've made it. So don't get paralyzed by when you're making decisions. Another point, and I think this is something perhaps as an industry we don't do enough, and that is get help. Consult people that you trust. But make sure if you're looking for advice that you don't bias your listener. You want to be sure you're asking the question in a manner that you're not hinting to them what your personal preference would be. You want people who will give you the unvarnished truth, and that means you have to be mature enough to be able to accept their criticism, their advice, their suggestion, even when it goes against what you've already wanted to have happen. A lot of people, when it comes to marriage or something, they don't ask their parents for help and for advice, and if they do ask their parents, they do it in such a way that they won't get the honest answer from their parents about whether they think this particular person is right for you. Well, don't ask a question that you don't want an honest answer for. So you need to find people who have enough moral fortitude to tell you something you don't want to hear. And you also need to be mature enough to maintain your friendship with them, even when they tell you something that's painful. That's easier said than done, especially for things that are very passionate about. So it's something you definitely want to consider. Well, that's sort of an overview of what some of the things that Annie Duke talks about. And again, her 3 books are Thinking in Bets, How to Decide, and Quit. And so if you're interested in learning more about this, you, of course, you can check her out, Annie Duke, or you can go back to her website, of course, alliancefordecisioneducation.org, and so there's other resources there that you can certainly do. I hope this was helpful for you to think about your decision-making process. May it be helpful in your decision-making process so that you're doing things less on a reaction or by the seat of your pants, but you're thinking seriously about some of your decisions so that you can have more success and less pain in your life. Well, I'm Stephen Van Tassel. I'm the owner of Wildlife Control Consultant. Would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, or you can also reach out to me, of course, on Facebook. Do join our Pestgeek Podcast family on Facebook. And then, of course, you can get the podcast from YouTube or from Rumble. Would love to get a 5-star review from you if you could. Write a review. Make sure you ring the bell. Become a subscriber to the channel. Again, if you have comments, thoughts, suggestions for different shows, reach out to me, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pestgeek Podcast family. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.